The memory of his touch refused to leave her. Even now, Arielle Vaughn stood in the middle of JFK Airport, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a small black suitcase. Travelers moved around her in every direction, rolling luggage, murmured conversations, hurried footsteps echoing across the polished floor. But Arielle wasn't moving. She barely noticed the movement around her. Her eyes were tired, not the kind of tired that comes from missing sleep. No, this was deeper, the kind that settles quietly inside a person after carrying too many thoughts for too long. She inhaled slowly, held the breath, then released it. And the memory returned again, clearer this time, stronger. It had happened only hours earlier. They had been standing in the hallway outside the study at the Mercer estate, arguing. Well, not exactly arguing, more like circling around something neither of them wanted to say out loud. Conrad Mercer had been leaning against the doorway, his expression calm in that frustrating way he had. Arielle remembered crossing her arms, trying to hold her ground, trying not to react, trying not to notice the way he was watching her. But then he stepped closer, slowly, not aggressively, just closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that her breathing had suddenly become noticeable. She had looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Conrad did something that caught her completely off guard. He reached out, not suddenly, not forcefully, just slowly, deliberately. His hand rested lightly against the small of her back. The contact had been gentle, barely there, but the warmth of his palm had spread through her instantly. Arielle remembered the way her breath had caught, just slightly, the way her shoulders had stiffened for a moment before relaxing without her permission, and the way Conrad's voice had lowered when he spoke. Careful, Arielle. Quiet, calm, too calm. You're standing very close to a man you claim to dislike. She had opened her mouth to argue, to remind him that this marriage was nothing more than a contract. But the words never came, because his hand was still there, warm, steady, and somehow her body had betrayed her completely. Even now, standing in the middle of JFK Airport, the memory made her chest tighten. Arielle swallowed, her fingers curled again around the suitcase handle. Why does he still make me feel this way? She whispered. But that memory, it wasn't only the way his hand had rested against her back. No, it was what happened after. Arielle could still see that quiet hallway inside the Mercer estate, the soft lights along the wall, the faint scent of cedar drifting from Conrad's study, and the silence, that strange silence when two people suddenly realize they're standing closer than they should be. Her eyes had lifted to his. Conrad Mercer rarely showed emotion. His expression was usually calm, controlled, but that night something in his gaze lingered. Thoughtful, almost careful. His hand stayed where it was, warm, steady. Arielle remembered the way her breath had caught for a second. She had tried to step away, just a little, but his hand shifted slightly, resting firmer against her back, not trapping her, just keeping her there. He murmured quietly, like he had just realized something. Arielle frowned. What? Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Conrad studied her for a moment. You're nervous. She blinked. Nervous? Yes. His voice stayed calm. You're pretending not to be. But your breathing changed. Arielle scoffed softly. Well, maybe that's because you're standing too close. For a second, Conrad said nothing. Then his hand slowly moved away. And strangely, the absence of that warmth felt louder than the touch itself. Even now, standing inside JFK Airport, Arielle could still remember it. But the truth was, that moment in the hallway wasn't the one that truly changed everything. No, that came later, at a charity gala in Manhattan, a ballroom filled with quiet conversations and watchful eyes, people whispering about them, about the strange marriage, the young woman, the powerful billionaire twice her age, Ariel remembered one comment clearly, a careless remark near the bar, the kind that sounded polite, but wasn't. Her fingers had tightened around her glass. She had been ready to answer. But Conrad spoke first, his voice low, calm, ending the conversation before it could grow uglier. That was the first time she had looked at him differently. But the real mistake happened later that night. Back at the Mercer estate. Too much wine, too many emotions. A quiet argument that neither of them had planned. Ariel shifted slightly in the airport terminal. Her grip on the suitcase tightened again. Because that argument had ended with Conrad pulling her closer. Too close. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. Close enough that the space between them disappeared. And before either of them could stop it, they kissed. Slow, unexpected. A mistake neither of them ever talked about again. But somehow, neither of them forgot. Ariel exhaled quietly. Her eyes lifted to the glowing departure screens above the terminal. Because that kiss had been the beginning of something neither of them understood. Something complicated, something dangerous. Feelings. And before we continue, let me ask you something. What would you do if someone forced you into a marriage contract with a man you believed you could never trust, but somewhere along the way, you started noticing the way he looked at you? Before we go back to the beginning of this story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Ms. Wink's Stories. It helps YouTube share stories like this with more people. Because 5 years earlier, Ariel Vaughn had received a call from a Manhattan law firm. A strange request. A meeting with a man named Conrad Mercer. And if she had known what that meeting would lead to, she might have turned around before ever stepping through the gates of his estate. But she didn't. And that was where everything began. Brooklyn woke slowly that morning, not all at once. First came the distant hum of traffic along the avenue. Then the low rumble of the subway passing beneath the streets. Somewhere down the block, a delivery truck hissed to a stop, followed by the sharp clatter of metal crates being unloaded. The city always seemed to stretch itself awake like that. Gradually, patiently. Inside a narrow brick building on a quieter street, warm light spilled across a second-floor studio window. Dust particles drifted lazily through the air, glowing softly where the sunlight reached them. The room smelled faintly of oil paint, old canvas, and varnish. Ariel Vaughn leaned forward over a long wooden table, her attention fixed on the fragile painting beneath her hands. She held a fine brush between her fingers. Steady, careful, the kind of steadiness that only comes from years of practice. Her breathing slowed as she worked. One small movement at a time. A touch of pigment here, a gentle correction there. The painting had once been damaged along the lower edge. Time had faded the colors and cracked the surface into delicate lines. But under Ariel's careful hands, those details were returning. Piece by piece, like memories being restored. She leaned back slightly, studying the canvas with quiet concentration. Almost, she murmured under her breath. The word barely carried across the studio. Outside the window, a car horn sounded somewhere in the distance. Ariel didn't look up. When she worked, the world outside usually faded away. And honestly, she preferred it that way. Ariel Vaughn had always been comfortable in quiet spaces, not because she disliked people. Well, maybe a little, but mostly because silence allowed her to think, and Ariel liked thinking things through, carefully. She was 28 years old, with smooth dark skin and expressive eyes that rarely revealed everything she was feeling. Those eyes were focused again now on the painting in front of her, studying, evaluating. She tilted her head slightly. The sound escaped her almost automatically, a habit she had developed over the years whenever something required patience. Ariel reached for a cloth beside the table and gently wiped her brush. Her movements were calm, measured, nothing rushed. That was another thing people noticed about her. Ariel Vaughn rarely hurried into anything. Decisions, conversations, relationships. Everything in her life moved at a pace she controlled. Because experience had taught her something important. When people rush, they miss things. and Ariel had no interest in missing anything again. Art restoration wasn't a career many people understood. Whenever Ariel mentioned it, she usually received the same confused expression. "So you repaint old paintings?" Not exactly. What she actually did was far more delicate than that. Ariel restored damaged artwork, carefully preserving the original brushstrokes, while repairing the effects of time. It required patience, precision, and a certain respect for history. The painting in front of her now had arrived from a private collector in Manhattan 2 weeks earlier. Early 20th century, oil on canvas, beautiful work. But the lower corner had suffered years of neglect. Ariel studied that section again. Her finger hovered just above the surface without touching it. Almost finished. The colors now blended smoothly with the original strokes. Unless someone looked very closely, they would never notice where the damage had once been. And that was the goal. Restoration wasn't about changing the past. It was about helping something survive it. Ariel straightened slowly. Her back stretched as she rolled her shoulders. "Okay," she muttered quietly. "That should do it." Across the room, several other paintings rested against padded stands, each waiting their turn beneath her careful attention. The small studio wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and that mattered. The studio had started with almost nothing. One rented room, one work table, a few borrowed tools. Ariel could still remember the day she signed the lease. Her hands had trembled slightly while holding the pen. Not from fear. Well, maybe a little, but mostly from the weight of responsibility. Starting a business meant there would be no one else to rely on if things went wrong. And that had been exactly what she wanted. Control. Independence. Now the studio held 3 workstations and a small storage area filled with protective crates and restoration supplies. 2 assistants worked here during the week. Young artists still learning the craft. They moved quietly through the space most mornings, careful not to disturb the delicate work in progress. Ariel liked that rhythm, the quiet focus, the sense that everyone here respected the work. She walked slowly across the studio now, checking the other paintings waiting along the wall. Her fingertips brushed lightly against the edge of one frame. "You'll be next," she murmured softly. Talking to artwork might have seemed strange to some people, but restoration required patience, and patience often required conversation. Even if the painting never answered, Ariel didn't always prefer solitude. There had been a time when she believed relationships could bring something good into her life. That belief had faded slowly. The first man she trusted had been charming, attentive, the kind of person who said exactly what someone wanted to hear. Ariel remembered discovering the truth about him months later. The quiet message on his phone, the awkward explanations that followed, the way he avoided meeting her eyes. She had ended that relationship the same night, cleanly, without shouting, without drama. The second relationship had ended differently. No betrayal, just disappearance. Responsibility arrived, and suddenly he was gone. Ariel had stood in her kitchen holding her phone that day, listening to silence after the call ended. "Right," she had muttered softly. That had been the moment something shifted inside her. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. Some people stayed, some people didn't. And depending on someone to stay was a risk she no longer felt interested in taking. From that day forward, Ariel Vaughn built her life around something far more reliable: herself. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the studio floor. Ariel had just returned to the painting she finished earlier when the phone rang. Once, twice. She glanced toward the small desk near the window. The number displayed on the screen wasn't familiar. Manhattan area code. Ariel wiped her hands on a cloth before picking up the phone. "Hello?" There was a brief pause. Then a professional voice answered. "Good afternoon. May I speak with Ariel Vaughn? This is she." Another pause. "Ms. Vaughn, my name is Daniel Whitaker. I'm calling from Whitaker and Grant Law Offices in Manhattan." Ariel leaned lightly against the edge of the desk. "All right." Her voice carried mild curiosity. nothing more. The man continued. One of our clients would like to arrange a meeting with you. Ariel frowned slightly. A meeting about, well, the lawyer hesitated for a moment. As I understand it, the request concerns a personal proposal. Ariel blinked once. A proposal? Yes. The word hung strangely in the air between them. And who exactly is this client? She asked. Another brief pause. Then the lawyer answered calmly. Mr. Conrad Mercer. The name meant nothing to her. At least, not yet. Ariel leaned slightly against the desk, staring toward the window. Why does a man I've never met want to speak with me? The lawyer replied gently. Mr. Mercer believes the conversation would be mutually beneficial. Ariel exhaled quietly. Well, that sounds mysterious. The lawyer gave a polite chuckle. Mr. Mercer would prefer to explain the details in person. Silence settled for a moment. Then Ariel asked the question that felt most obvious. And who exactly is Conrad Mercer? The lawyer answered simply. He's a businessman. A pause. Then he added one more detail. A very successful one. Ariel tapped her finger lightly against the desk. She had no idea yet that the man behind that name would soon become the most complicated person in her life. But the meeting was already arranged. And once Ariel Vaughn agreed to something, she rarely backed out. Morning arrived differently in Greenwich, not with the restless noise of the city like Brooklyn. Here, things began quietly. The Mercer estate stretched across several acres of carefully maintained land. Tall trees lined the long driveway, their branches swaying gently in the early breeze. A black iron gate guarded the entrance. Beyond it, the estate stood in calm silence. Stone walls, wide windows, generations of wealth built into every detail. Inside the main house, the halls were still. Footsteps echoed softly across polished floors. Somewhere deeper inside the estate, a clock chimed once, then twice. The sound carried through the house in a slow, steady rhythm. Unlike the noise of Brooklyn, nothing here rushed. Everything moved with quiet control, and the man who owned the estate preferred it exactly that way. Conrad Mercer stood near the tall windows of his private study, looking out across the grounds. He held a glass of water in one hand. Untouched. His posture was straight, disciplined, the kind of composure that came from decades of careful self-control. At 58 years old, Conrad Mercer had built a reputation that few people questioned. Private, direct, powerful. His dark suit fit perfectly, though there was no audience to notice it this early in the morning. Conrad believed in routine, structure, order. Things either worked or they didn't. And when they didn't, he corrected them. Quickly. He set the glass down on the desk beside him. The quiet sound escaped him as his eyes moved toward a folder resting near the edge of the desk. Inside, it was a name he had been considering carefully. Ariel Vaughn, but that decision would come later. For now, his thoughts were elsewhere. The Mercer family had never been poor, not even close. Their wealth began nearly a century earlier, when Conrad's great-grandfather invested heavily in railroads during the early expansion of American industry. That investment changed everything. Railroads became shipping routes. Shipping routes became trade. Trade opened the door to international partnerships. Over time, the Mercer name expanded into multiple industries: rail transport, investment funds, shipping, and global trade. Quiet deals made in boardrooms. Decisions that moved millions of dollars without drawing public attention. Conrad had grown up surrounded by that world. He understood money the same way some people understood language, naturally. But wealth had never been the thing that shaped him most. That lesson came from somewhere else entirely. For most of his adult life, Conrad Mercer avoided one thing completely: marriage. Not because he disliked women. No. Conrad simply didn't believe in the idea of marriage itself. To him, it had always seemed like an arrangement people entered for appearances, expectations, convenience, not love. He had seen too much evidence of that growing up, and those memories stayed with him longer than he ever expected. Sometimes, late at night, certain voices still returned to him, raised, sharp, echoing down long hallways, voices that belonged to his parents. Conrad had been 14 years old the night he first understood what his parents' marriage truly looked like. The memory remained clear. He had been walking down the hallway toward the staircase when he heard them arguing inside the sitting room. Their voices were low at first, controlled, but tension filled every word. "You care more about the Mercer name than this family," his mother had said. His father answered almost immediately, "And you knew exactly what this marriage was when you agreed to it." A pause followed, heavy. Then his mother spoke again. It was never supposed to feel this empty. Silence. Then his father's voice, colder now. "Marriage isn't about feelings, it's about stability, legacy, responsibility." Young Conrad had stood frozen in the hallway, listening. Something about that moment stayed with him. Not the argument itself, but the realization behind it. The understanding that love had never been the reason they stayed together. That night, Conrad quietly turned away from the door and walked back to his room. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet conclusion formed. Marriage was performance, not love. For decades, Conrad Mercer lived his life according to that belief. Business first, discipline always, personal attachments kept simple, and marriage avoided completely. Until recently, now the folder on his desk reminded him why that had changed. The Mercer family trust. His grandfather had written the condition years ago. At the time, Conrad had ignored it. The clause stated clearly that a significant portion of the Mercer inheritance would only transfer under one requirement. Conrad had to be legally married for 5 consecutive years. Only then would he gain control of the remaining assets. Billions of dollars tied to a single condition. For years, Conrad dismissed it. He had no interest in marriage. But now a major international investment opportunity required access to those funds, which meant the condition could no longer be ignored. Conrad exhaled slowly. His eyes returned to the name inside the folder, Ariel Vaughn. He didn't need love. He didn't expect loyalty. All he needed was cooperation, a wife, only on paper, nothing more. The road leading to Mercer Estate curved gently through tall trees before ending at a large iron gate. Beyond it, the long driveway stretched toward the main house in the distance. Ariel Vaughn slowed her car as she approached the entrance. She glanced at the navigation screen on her dashboard, checking the address again. Yes, this was the place. Greenwich, Connecticut, a long way from Brooklyn. The estate looked exactly like the kind of property someone unimaginably wealthy would own. Stone pillars stood on both sides of the gate. Security cameras were mounted high above them. Everything about the entrance suggested control, privacy. Ariel turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The air felt different here, quieter, cooler. For a moment, she simply looked down the long driveway. "Well," she murmured softly. "So this is where billionaires live." Her voice carried a hint of dry amusement. Then she walked toward the gate. The trip from Brooklyn had taken longer than expected. Traffic leaving the city had been heavy. Then there was the drive through unfamiliar roads once she reached Connecticut. By the time Ariel reached the estate, patience was already running thin. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and approached the small security booth beside the gate. A guard stepped outside almost immediately. Professional, alert. "Good afternoon," he said. Ariel nodded once. "Hi. I have an appointment." "With who?" "Conrad Mercer." The guard paused slightly, then checked a tablet inside the booth. Ariel crossed her arms lightly as she waited. A few seconds passed, then a few more. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the long driveway again. Still quiet, still distant. "Is there a problem?" she asked calmly. The guard looked up. "I don't see your name on today's visitor list." Ariel blinked once. "What?" The guard remained polite, but firm. "If your name isn't on the list, I can't open the gate." Ariel inhaled slowly, then released the breath. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Well, someone from his law office called me yesterday. She tapped the screen, scrolling briefly. Whitaker and Grant. The guard listened but didn't move toward the gate controls. I understand, he said, but without confirmation from the house, I can't allow entry. Ariel studied him for a moment, then nodded once. All right, she could work with that. Her voice stayed calm, measured. I drove almost 2 hours to get here, she said. The meeting was scheduled by Mr. Mercer's lawyers. She gestured lightly toward the estate. So, maybe you should call the house and confirm. The guard hesitated. One moment. He turned slightly toward the booth. But before he reached the door, another voice spoke from behind them. It's fine. Both Ariel and the guard turned. A man was walking down the path from the direction of the main house. Tall, calm, dressed in a dark suit despite the quiet afternoon. His steps were unhurried, controlled. The guard immediately straightened. Mr. Mercer. Ariel's eyes moved toward the man. So this was him. Conrad Mercer. He stopped a few feet away from the gate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Conrad studied her quietly. Ariel noticed the way he carried himself. Still, observant, like someone used to evaluating situations before speaking. Her gaze didn't drop. She simply looked back at him, directly, without the nervous politeness he was probably used to. You're Conrad Mercer? She asked. His expression remained calm. Yes. Ariel exhaled softly. Good. There was a small pause. Because your lawyers made a very strange request. For a brief moment, the air between them felt still, not tense exactly, just attentive. Conrad's gaze lingered on her face, as if studying something unexpected. Most people reacted differently when meeting him. There was usually recognition, or nervous admiration. Ariel showed neither. Instead, she observed him the way she observed damaged paintings in her studio. Curiously, like she was trying to understand what she was looking at. Conrad noticed that immediately. His eyes narrowed just slightly, not in irritation, in interest. This woman wasn't trying to impress him, and strangely, that made her more interesting. The silence broke when Ariel spoke again. Your lawyers made a strange request. Conrad's expression barely changed. They tend to do that. Ariel tilted her head slightly. You summoned me like an employee. For the first time, a faint reaction touched Conrad's face. Not quite a smile, but close. You argued with my security guard. Ariel glanced briefly toward the guard, then back at Conrad. He wouldn't open the gate. Another pause settled between them. Something about the exchange felt almost amusing. Neither of them said it, but both noticed it. Curiosity. Conrad finally gestured toward the estate behind him. Since you've come this far, he said calmly, we might as well talk. The gate unlocked with a quiet mechanical click. Ariel heard the sound and looked at it briefly, then back at him. All right. She stepped forward, and without realizing it yet, Ariel Vaughn walked through the gates of Mercer Estate for the first time, toward a conversation that would change everything. The Mercer Estate was even larger inside than it appeared from the gate. Ariel walked a few steps behind Conrad as he led her through a long hallway lined with framed artwork and polished wooden panels. Her eyes moved briefly from one painting to another. Original pieces, old ones, carefully preserved. Whoever managed the estate's collection clearly understood their value. Conrad opened a tall door at the end of the hall. The library, he said simply. Ariel stepped inside. The room felt quiet in a different way than the rest of the house. Tall shelves stretched along the walls, filled with books bound in dark leather. A large window overlooked the back gardens, letting soft daylight spill across a heavy wooden table in the center of the room. Ariel paused just inside the doorway. Well, her voice carried a hint of quiet surprise. You don't do anything halfway, do you? Conrad moved calmly toward the table. I prefer preparation. Ariel stepped further into the room, her gaze moving slowly across the shelves. Something about the space felt deliberate, ordered, controlled, just like the man who owned it. Conrad gestured toward one of the chairs near the table. Please. Ariel hesitated for a moment. Then, she sat down. The chair was solid, comfortable, but the reason she was here still felt unclear. She folded her hands loosely on the table. All right, she said after a small pause. So what exactly did your lawyers drag me all the way out here for? Conrad remained standing for a moment. Then he walked to the opposite side of the table and placed a thin folder on the polished surface. He slid it toward her. What's this? Ariel asked. A proposal. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. A business proposal? Not exactly. Ariel opened the folder. Her eyes moved across the first page, then stopped. She blinked once, then again. She looked up at him slowly. This is a marriage contract. Yes. Ariel stared at him for a second, then leaned back in the chair. You're joking. Conrad's expression didn't change. No. Ariel let out a short breath. Right. She closed the folder gently. Well, that's creative. Her tone carried a faint note of disbelief. You had me drive 2 hours to Connecticut for a joke about marriage? It isn't a joke. Ariel watched him carefully now, trying to determine whether he was serious, and slowly, she realized he was. The quiet inside the library grew heavier. Ariel tapped her fingers lightly against the folder. Why me? She asked. Conrad answered without hesitation, because you're practical. She gave a small laugh. You don't know anything about me. I know enough. Ariel's eyes narrowed slightly. Do you? Conrad reached into the folder and removed another document. He placed it beside the contract. Your studio, he said calmly. Ariel glanced down at the paper. Her expression shifted, just slightly. What about it? The building where your restoration studio operates. He paused briefly. It belongs to Mercer Holdings. The realization moved slowly through her expression. Wait. She straightened in the chair. You own the building? Yes. Ariel stared at the document again, then back at him. And you're telling me this because... Conrad's voice stayed calm. If you refuse the agreement, the lease will end within 30 days. Silence settled between them. Heavy. Still. Ariel's fingers slowly curled against the edge of the table. You're serious? Yes. Her eyes didn't leave his face. And if the lease ends... Conrad finished the sentence quietly. Your studio closes. Ariel stood up. Slowly. The chair moved back across the floor with a soft sound. She ran a hand lightly across her forehead, processing the information. So let me understand this. Her voice remained controlled. Careful. You invite me here, present a marriage contract, and then inform me you own the building where my business operates. Conrad didn't interrupt. Ariel exhaled slowly, then looked directly at him. So you're forcing me to marry you? Conrad's reply came calmly. I'm offering security. Ariel shook her head once. A short, disbelieving laugh escaped her. That's an interesting way to describe blackmail. Neither of them moved. The tension between them remained steady. Ariel studied him for a moment, then asked quietly, You don't trust women, do you? Conrad answered without hesitation, No. The honesty of the answer surprised her. Ariel held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she looked down at the contract again. Minutes passed in silence. Ariel remained standing beside the table, reading the document carefully. 5 years. That was the length of the contract. 5 years of marriage. Public appearances when necessary. No personal obligations beyond cooperation. A business arrangement. Nothing more. Her mind returned briefly to the studio in Brooklyn. The paintings waiting there. The assistants who depended on that space. All of it could disappear in 30 days. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing slowly. You planned this carefully, she said quietly. Conrad didn't deny it. Ariel opened her eyes again. And if I say no, the lease ends. Simple, direct, no drama. Just fact. Ariel stared at the paper for another moment. Then she reached for the pen lying beside the contract. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Ariel held it above the paper for a moment. Her fingers hesitated slightly. 5 years. 5 years tied to a man she had met less than an hour ago. A man who clearly believed marriage was nothing more than an arrangement. Her hand moved slowly across the page. The signature formed in steady ink. Ariel Vaughn. She placed the pen down gently, then looked up at him. There, her voice was quiet, but steady. You have your cooperation. Conrad closed the folder calmly. For him, the decision looked simple, practical. But Ariel felt the shift immediately. Something in her life had just changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just suddenly. And once that signature dried on the page, there was no going back. The wedding happened 2 weeks later. Quietly. No music. No guests beyond the legal witnesses required for the documents. The ceremony took place in a private office inside a government building in Manhattan. Ariel stood beside Conrad while the clerk reviewed the paperwork. The room smelled faintly of paper and old furniture. Nothing about the moment resembled a celebration. No flowers, no photographs, just signatures. Ariel glanced briefly at Conrad standing beside her. He looked exactly the same as he had the day she signed the contract. Calm, composed, like this was nothing more than another business agreement. Which, technically, it was. The clerk cleared his throat softly. Please sign here. Ariel took the pen. For a moment her fingers hesitated. Not because she expected romance. No, she already knew there would be none. Still, there was something strange about realizing this moment would change the direction of her life. She signed, then slid the pen toward Conrad. He signed immediately. No pause. No hesitation, just ink on paper. The clerk stamped the documents. Congratulations, he said politely. Neither of them reacted. Later that evening, Ariel arrived at Mercer Estate with a single suitcase. A house staff member carried it upstairs while Conrad walked beside her down a long hallway. They stopped near a set of tall double doors. This will be your room, Conrad said. Ariel looked inside. The bedroom was large, elegant, far larger than any place she had lived before. She stepped inside slowly. Her voice carried quiet observation. You weren't kidding about separate spaces. Conrad stood near the doorway. Our arrangement will remain uncomplicated. Ariel crossed her arms slightly. Meaning, he answered plainly. Separate bedrooms. A short pause. Separate lives. Another pause. Public appearances only when necessary. Ariel nodded slowly. Right. That was exactly what the contract had said. Still, hearing the rules spoken out loud made them feel more real, more permanent. She looked at him again. Well, at least we agree on something. Conrad tilted his head slightly. And what's that? Ariel shrugged. That pretending to be in love would be exhausting. The first weeks of their marriage followed a careful routine. Ariel continued working at her studio in Brooklyn. Most mornings, she left the estate early. Most evenings she returned late. Their schedules rarely overlapped. When they did cross paths, their conversations remained brief, polite, controlled. Ariel made no effort to act like a traditional wife. She didn't hover near him, didn't ask personal questions, didn't pretend the marriage meant anything more than the agreement they signed. One evening they passed each other in the hallway near the staircase. Conrad had just returned from a meeting. Ariel was heading upstairs. They paused for a moment. Long day? He asked. She shrugged lightly. Normal day. A short silence followed. Then Ariel continued walking. Neither of them seemed particularly bothered by the distance. At least, that's what they told themselves. Conrad adjusted to the arrangement easily. Or at least it appeared that way. His routine rarely changed. Business meetings, financial briefings, long hours inside the study. Marriage had always been something he avoided. Now that he was technically married, he treated the situation exactly as the contract described. Structured, practical, controlled. But sometimes, without intending to, he noticed things. Small details. The sound of Ariel's footsteps crossing the hallway in the morning. The quiet way she examined the artwork inside the estate. The thoughtful expression she wore when studying paintings. Once, during dinner in the dining room, he caught himself watching her longer than necessary. Ariel looked up suddenly. Their eyes met. Conrad looked away first. "Wine?" he asked calmly. Ariel blinked once. "Sure." Neither of them mentioned the moment. Time passed. Weeks turned into months. The distance between them remained mostly intact. But small things began shifting. Not dramatically, just subtle changes. Lingering glances during quiet dinners. Brief conversations that lasted longer than expected. Moments where neither of them immediately walked away. One evening, Ariel entered the living room while Conrad was reading. She paused near the bookshelf. "You actually read these?" she asked. Conrad closed the book slowly. "Yes." Ariel tilted her head. I assumed they were decorative." Conrad's mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. "Some of them." The conversation lasted only a few minutes. But afterward, Ariel found herself thinking about it longer than she expected. And Conrad, well, he noticed that too. One night the mansion was completely quiet. Most of the staff had gone to sleep hours earlier. Ariel walked slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen. She couldn't sleep. It had been one of those nights where her thoughts refused to settle. She opened the kitchen door quietly. The lights were already on. Ariel stopped. Conrad stood near the counter pouring a glass of water. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. Ariel stepped inside. "Apparently not." She walked toward the counter. "I just needed water." Conrad nodded toward the cabinet. "Glasses are there." Ariel reached toward the cabinet. At the same moment, Conrad moved to place a glass down. Their hands touched, only briefly, but both of them froze. The contact felt unexpectedly warm. Ariel's fingers pulled back slightly, but Conrad hadn't moved yet. Their eyes lifted at the same time. Something quiet passed between them, unspoken. Neither of them seemed quite sure what to do with the moment. Then Conrad reached forward slowly. His hand lifted near her face. Ariel didn't move. He brushed a loose strand of hair away from her cheek. The gesture was gentle, careful. Ariel's breath caught softly. "Thanks," she murmured. Her voice came out quieter than intended. Neither of them mentioned how close they were standing. The moment ended quickly, almost awkwardly. Conrad stepped back first. Ariel poured water into the glass. They stood there for a few seconds longer. "Good night," Conrad said. "Good night." He left the kitchen. Ariel remained standing beside the counter. Her fingers tightened slightly around the glass. She took a slow breath. That moment had felt different, strangely intimate, and neither of them had expected it. Later that night, Ariel lay awake in her room staring at the ceiling. Across the hallway, Conrad remained awake as well. Both of them replayed the same moment quietly in their minds. But by morning, neither of them mentioned it, and yet, something between them had shifted, just slightly. The ballroom in Manhattan glowed beneath rows of warm chandelier lights. Soft music drifted through the air, while guests moved across the polished floor in elegant evening attire. Conversations rose and fell in quiet waves around the room. Ariel stepped beside Conrad as they entered. Her dress was simple but striking, deep black silk that moved gently as she walked. She paused near the entrance, glancing around the room. "This is different from restoring paintings in Brooklyn," she murmured quietly. Conrad adjusted the cuff of his jacket. "These events are mostly routine." Ariel raised one eyebrow slightly. "Well, they seem expensive." Conrad didn't respond to that. Instead, his attention moved across the room as several people approached them. Because wherever Conrad Mercer went, attention followed. It didn't take long for the murmurs to begin. Ariel noticed them immediately. Not loud, just quiet conversations drifting through the crowd, people glancing at them, looking again. One woman leaned toward her companion. "That's her," she whispered. "The wife," another voice answered softly. "She looks younger than I expected." Ariel took a slow sip from the glass in her hand, pretending not to hear. But the comments continued, their eyes moving from Conrad to Ariel and back again. The difference in age was obvious. The assumptions were easy. Ariel exhaled slowly. "Well," she murmured under her breath. "This is entertaining." The comment came near the bar. A tall man with a polished smile stepped closer while Conrad spoke with another guest. His voice sounded friendly, but something in his tone felt off. "So, you're the new Mrs. Mercer?" Ariel nodded politely. "That's correct." The man tilted his head slightly. "Interesting." He leaned a little closer. "You must have very good timing." Ariel blinked once. "Timing?" "Yes." His smile widened. "Marrying a man like Conrad Mercer tends to solve a lot of financial problems." The meaning behind the words settled slowly. "Heavy." Ariel's fingers tightened slightly around her glass. "I see." Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. "That's enough." Conrad had stepped beside her. His expression remained calm, but his eyes had sharpened. The investor's smile faded slightly. "Conrad, I was only joking." Conrad's voice stayed steady. "I didn't ask for your opinion." The words were simple, but firm. The man cleared his throat awkwardly. "Of course." He stepped away quickly. The moment passed, but Ariel remained still. She glanced at Conrad. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her briefly. "Yes, I did." There was no emotion in his voice, just certainty. And strangely, for the first time since their marriage began, Ariel saw him differently. The evening stretched longer than expected. More conversations, more introductions, more glasses of wine. Ariel rarely drank much, but tonight felt different. The whispers, the tension, everything pressed quietly against her patience. By the time they left the ballroom, the city lights outside looked slightly softer than usual. She leaned back against the seat in the car. That was exhausting. Conrad glanced toward her briefly. "You handled it well." Ariel laughed quietly. "Did I?" She turned her head toward the window. "Because I wanted to throw my drink at that man." Conrad didn't smile, but something in his expression softened slightly. Back at the Mercer estate, the quiet felt heavier than usual. Ariel stepped into the living room and removed her heels. She exhaled slowly. "I suppose this is part of the agreement." Conrad loosened his tie. "What is? Being judged by strangers?" He paused. "That was unfortunate." Ariel laughed lightly. "Unfortunate?" She turned toward him. "Well, maybe you're used to it." Conrad's voice remained calm. "You knew the arrangement would attract attention." "Yes." She stepped closer now. "But I didn't realize how much people would assume." The room fell quiet. Their conversation slowed, and somehow they were suddenly standing closer than before. Conrad spoke first. His voice was quieter now, lower than before. "You deserved better than the things they said tonight." Ariel let out a small laugh. Not amused, more like nervous. "Coming from the man who forced me into this marriage?" Her words were sharp, but the edge behind them had softened. And, strangely, she didn't step away. The space between them had narrowed without either of them noticing. Conrad's hand moved slowly. Not suddenly, just carefully. His fingers settled lightly around her arm. The contact was warm. Ariel inhaled softly. "You're drunk," she murmured. "Possibly," Conrad replied. Neither of them moved. The room felt quiet. Too quiet. Ariel could feel the warmth of his hand through the thin fabric of her dress. Her eyes lifted slowly to his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Conrad's gaze lingered on her face. Thoughtful, studying, almost cautious, like he was considering whether to cross a line he had spent months avoiding. Ariel felt it too, that strange pull between them, the one that had started with small moments. The midnight kitchen, the lingering glances, the quiet conversations neither of them expected. Her breath slowed. "Conrad," she said softly. But the rest of the sentence never came, because he leaned closer, and this time, neither of them stopped it. Their lips met, slow, careful at first, almost uncertain. Ariel's hand lifted instinctively, pressing lightly against his chest as if she might push him away, but she didn't. Instead, her fingers curled slightly against the fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened, not rushed, not aggressive, just inevitable, like something that had been building quietly for weeks. Conrad's hand moved to the small of her back, pulling her closer. Ariel felt her heart quicken. "This is a bad idea," she whispered against his lips. "Yes." But neither of them stepped back. The room seemed smaller now, warmer. Their breaths mingled between pauses. Another kiss followed, then another. Ariel exhaled softly. "We shouldn't." But Conrad's hand brushed gently along her waist, and the sentence faded before she finished it. The silence between them filled with something heavier than words, something neither of them had planned, and suddenly the distance between the living room and the hallway felt very small. Ariel wasn't sure who moved first. Maybe it was both of them. Slow steps, quiet, their hands brushing together again as they walked. No conversation now, just the soft sound of their footsteps along the floor. The bedroom door opened. The lights remained low. For a moment, they simply stood there, breathing, looking at each other. Ariel's voice came out softer than she expected. "We can still pretend this didn't happen." Conrad studied her face. "We could." Neither of them moved toward the door. Instead, he stepped closer again, and the hesitation between them disappeared. The night stretched quietly around them, not rushed, not planned. Just two people who had spent months pretending nothing existed between them, finally stopping the act. Morning arrived slowly at the Mercer estate. Soft sunlight slipped through the tall bedroom windows, spreading quietly across the floor. Ariel woke first. For a moment she didn't move. Her eyes remained half closed as the silence of the room settled around her. Then the memory returned. The gala, the argument, the kiss. Her breath caught slightly, and suddenly she was very aware of the warmth beside her. Ariel opened her eyes. Conrad was still asleep. His arm rested loosely across the space between them, his breathing slow and steady. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the ceiling. "Well," she whispered softly. Her voice barely reached the quiet room. That had not been part of the arrangement. Carefully, she shifted beneath the blankets, trying not to wake him. But the movement was enough. Conrad's breathing changed slightly. His eyes opened. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt different now. Not uncomfortable, exactly. Just aware. Conrad looked at her, then briefly toward the window. "Morning," he said quietly. Ariel nodded once. "Morning." Another pause followed. Neither of them mentioned the obvious. The room, the bed, the night they had both agreed should never happen. Ariel sat up slowly. The sheets moved softly around her. "I should probably..." She stopped mid-sentence, because she wasn't entirely sure how to finish that thought. Conrad watched her for a moment. His expression remained calm, but something thoughtful lingered in his eyes. Ariel slid carefully out of the bed and reached for the robe draped over the nearby chair. "Last night," she began, then stopped again. There were too many ways that sentence could go. None of them felt comfortable. Conrad leaned back slightly against the pillows. "We were both drinking," he said. His tone was steady, practical. Ariel nodded once. "Yes." Another pause. the kind filled with unspoken understanding. They both knew what he was suggesting, that the moment had been temporary, a mistake, something easier to ignore than explain. Ariel tied the robe loosely around her waist. "Right," she said softly. The word carried a faint hesitation, but neither of them challenged it. A few minutes later they met again in the dining room for breakfast. The staff moved quietly around the table. Coffee was poured. Plates were set down. Everything felt normal, almost too normal. Conrad read through a stack of documents beside his plate. Ariel stirred her coffee slowly. The silence between them stretched longer than usual. Finally, she cleared her throat. "You have meetings today?" Conrad glanced up briefly. "Yes. Busy day?" "Very." Ariel nodded once. "Good." The conversation ended there. Simple, polite, controlled, exactly the way their marriage had always been. But something beneath the surface had shifted, because every time their eyes accidentally met across the table, they both remembered the same thing: the warmth, the closeness. The quiet way their carefully arranged distance had disappeared for one night, and neither of them could pretend the memory didn't exist, even if they tried. After that night, things were different, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else inside the Mercer estate would notice. But for Ariel and Conrad, the air between them had shifted. They still followed the same routines. Breakfast at opposite ends of the table, short conversations about schedules, quiet evenings spent in different parts of the house. On the surface, nothing had changed, and yet, both of them were aware of the same memory: the kiss, the warmth of that night, the quiet moment when the rules of their arrangement had disappeared. Ariel tried not to think about it. She returned to Brooklyn every morning and buried herself in work at the studio. Paintings, colors, careful restoration. But sometimes her brush would pause mid-stroke, and her mind would drift back to that night. She would shake her head and focus again. Across town, Conrad worked the same way. Meetings, investments, reports stacked neatly on his desk. But occasionally, in the quiet moments between decisions, his thoughts returned to the same memory. Neither of them spoke about it, but neither of them forgot. The mansion had many hallways, long corridors lined with soft lighting and quiet artwork. Before that night, Ariel and Conrad passed through those spaces without much thought. Now, those moments felt different. One evening, Ariel turned the corner near the staircase. Conrad appeared at the opposite end. They slowed slightly. "Evening," he said. "Evening." A simple exchange. Yet neither of them continued walking immediately. Their eyes lingered, just briefly. Then Ariel cleared her throat softly. "Long day?" "Yes." "You look tired." Conrad gave a faint nod. "You too." Another pause. Then they continued in opposite directions. But both of them noticed the same thing. Their awareness of each other had sharpened, and neither of them quite understood why. Small moments became harder to ignore. A brush of hands when passing a document across the table. A brief contact while reaching for the same glass during dinner. Each touch lasted only a second, but it lingered afterward. One afternoon, Ariel stepped into the study doorway. "I left the restoration invoice on your desk," she said. Conrad nodded. "Thank you." She handed him the envelope. Their fingers touched. Just briefly, Ariel felt the warmth of his hand again. The same warmth she remembered from that night. She pulled her hand back quickly. "Right." Then she turned and walked away before either of them could say anything else. Inside the study, Conrad remained standing beside the desk, looking at the envelope, but not really seeing it. Weeks later, another event brought them back to Manhattan. This time it was a private dinner with investors. Ariel attended quietly beside him, observing, listening. Halfway through the evening, one guest leaned toward Conrad with a casual smile. "Your wife seems unusually quiet." The tone carried a subtle judgment. Conrad placed his glass down calmly. "She prefers listening to meaningless conversations before responding to them." The table went silent for a moment. Ariel blinked slightly, then looked at him. Conrad didn't meet her gaze. But the message had been clear. Later, as they left the restaurant, Ariel spoke softly beside him. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes," he replied. "Dead." Ariel studied him for a moment. And again, she saw something different behind his usual control, something protective. That night, Ariel found herself standing outside Conrad's study door, not knocking, just standing there. She realized something slowly. She didn't actually know very much about him. Not the man beyond the businessman. Not the person who had watched over her at dinner earlier. She raised her hand slightly toward the door, then stopped. "What am I doing?" she murmured softly. Ariel turned away, but the curiosity remained. And somewhere inside the study, Conrad sat quietly at his desk, unaware that she had almost knocked. Several nights later, Ariel returned late from Brooklyn. The sky had already opened into a heavy storm. Rain poured across the driveway as she stepped out of the car. Within seconds, her hair and coat were soaked. She hurried toward the front entrance, but the door opened before she reached it. Conrad stood there, his expression serious. "You're late," he said. Ariel brushed wet hair away from her face. "It's raining." "That's not what I meant." She frowned slightly. "Well, traffic exists, Conrad." Thunder rolled across the sky. Rain continued pouring down around them. Conrad stepped outside suddenly, grabbing her wrist gently. "Come here." He pulled her beneath the wide stone balcony near the entrance. The rain continued crashing against the driveway just beyond them, but the small space beneath the balcony was dry. And suddenly, they were standing very close again. Ariel's breathing slowed. "You were worried?" she asked quietly. Conrad didn't answer immediately. "You should have called." She shook her head slightly. "You're not supposed to care." Conrad's gaze held hers. "Neither are you." For a moment, neither of them moved. The storm continued around them, rain hitting the stone, wind brushing through the trees. Their faces were only inches apart now. Ariel could feel the warmth of his breath. Her eyes lowered briefly to his lips. The same thought crossed both their minds. Another kiss. Another moment they might not be able to take back. Conrad's hand tightened slightly around her wrist. Not pulling, just holding. But Ariel stepped back, suddenly breaking the moment. "Good night," she said quietly. Then she walked inside the mansion, leaving Conrad standing beneath the balcony. The rain continued falling outside, and both of them knew the same truth. They were getting dangerously close to something neither of them had planned, and neither of them was ready to admit it. A few days after the stormy night at the entrance, Ariel arrived at her studio earlier than usual. Brooklyn was just beginning to wake. The streets outside were quieter than normal. Inside the studio, the familiar scent of paint and varnish settled around her like it always did. Ariel set her bag down and glanced toward the stack of letters waiting on the desk. Most of them were routine, invoices, client confirmations, but one envelope stood out, thicker, official. She opened it slowly. Her eyes moved across the document, then stopped. "Wait." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. The letter detailed an attempted purchase of the building months earlier, an aggressive acquisition by a group of corporate investors. But at the bottom of the document was another note. The deal had been blocked by Mercer Holdings. Ariel stared at the paper. Her mind moved quickly. That attempt had happened weeks before she ever met Conrad. Before the contract. Before the marriage. And suddenly something felt different. Later that afternoon, Ariel sat across from the building manager who handled the property. He shifted slightly in his chair. "Yes, the investors pushed hard," he explained. "They wanted to redevelop the block. And Mercer Holdings stopped them?" Ariel asked. "Yes," the man nodded. "Personally approved by Conrad Mercer himself." Ariel blinked slowly. "Personally?" "Yes." The manager leaned back. "Honestly, if he hadn't stepped in, the building would have been gone months ago." Ariel sat quietly, her thoughts turning over the information again and again. Why? She murmured. The man shrugged. No idea. But Ariel had a growing suspicion. And suddenly the memory of that first meeting at the estate returned, the calm way Conrad had watched her, the strange certainty in his voice. Maybe that meeting hadn't been as sudden as she believed. That evening Ariel returned to the Mercer estate earlier than usual. The mansion felt quiet, still. She walked slowly through the hallway toward Conrad's study. For a moment she stood outside the door, thinking. Then she knocked. "Come in." Conrad sat behind his desk when she entered. Ariel didn't sit. She held the letter in her hand instead. "Did you know investors tried to buy my studio building?" Conrad looked at the paper. "Yes." "You stopped them." Another pause. "Yes." Ariel studied his face carefully. "That happened before our marriage." "Yes." Silence settled between them. Heavy. Realization moved slowly across her expression. "You were protecting the studio before you ever asked me to marry you." Conrad didn't deny it. Ariel stepped closer to the desk. "Why?" Her voice was quiet now. Not angry, just searching. Conrad leaned back slightly in the chair. "I saw your work at a private gallery showing last year." Ariel blinked. "You never said anything. There was no reason to." He paused briefly. "I admire independence." Ariel felt her chest tighten slightly. "You admired my independence enough to threaten my lease?" Conrad exhaled quietly. "I didn't know how else to approach you." The honesty in the words surprised both of them. Ariel looked away briefly. So this whole arrangement," her voice softened, "started because you noticed me?" Conrad didn't answer right away, but the silence spoke clearly enough. Ariel stepped closer again, now standing beside the desk. "You should have just talked to me. I doubt you would have agreed to dinner." Ariel almost smiled. "Probably not." The tension between them shifted, no longer defensive, just honest. Ariel looked down at the letter in her hand, then back at him. "You've been protecting my work this whole time." "Yes." "Even when I was angry with you." "Yes." Her voice softened slightly. "Why?" Conrad answered simply. "Because it mattered to you." The words lingered quietly between them. The silence stretched longer now. Neither of them moved. Finally, Ariel spoke again. "I tried to hate you." Her voice was barely louder than a whisper. Conrad looked up at her slowly. "I tried not to need you." The honesty in the room felt heavier than any argument they had shared before. Ariel stepped even closer. Close enough that the space between them almost disappeared. "This was supposed to be a contract," she murmured. "Yes, but it doesn't feel like one anymore." Conrad didn't answer. Because he felt it too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ariel's hand rested lightly against the edge of his desk. Conrad stood slowly. Now they were standing face to face. Closer than they had been since that night after the gala. Ariel exhaled softly. "This is dangerous." "Yes." But neither of them stepped back. The tension that had existed between them since the beginning of their marriage finally shifted. Not into something reckless. Something honest. Something real. Conrad's hand moved gently to hers. Their fingers intertwined naturally. For the first time since the contract began, their marriage no longer felt like an arrangement. It felt like a choice. And neither of them looked away. JFK Airport was just as crowded as it had been earlier that morning. Travelers moved quickly across the polished floor. Suitcases rolled past. Announcements echoed through the terminal speakers. But Ariel Vaughn stood still. Her hand rested on the handle of her suitcase again. The same suitcase she had packed in frustration only hours earlier. The argument replayed in her mind. The raised voices. The things said in anger. Neither of them had meant the words the way they sounded, but sometimes emotions moved faster than logic. She exhaled slowly. Well, her voice barely carried over the noise of the terminal. Leaving had seemed like the easiest decision at the time. Just space, just distance. Time to breathe. But, standing here now, the decision didn't feel as simple anymore. Her eyes drifted toward the departure screen above. Flights leaving, people arriving, life continuing. Yet her mind remained somewhere else entirely. Back at the Mercer estate, back with Conrad. The argument had started quietly, too quietly. A simple disagreement about the future, about the contract, about what would happen when the 5 years finally ended. Ariel had asked the question carefully. What happens when the agreement is over? Conrad had hesitated, just slightly, and that hesitation had hurt more than any argument. Because for the first time since their marriage began, she had wanted a different answer, not a business response, not a practical explanation, something personal, something real. But Conrad had remained silent too long, and Ariel had walked away. Now, standing in the middle of the airport, she realized something uncomfortable. She hadn't left because she stopped caring. She left because she cared too much. Ariel adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, preparing to move toward the gate. Then she heard it. Ariel, her name, spoken in a calm voice, she recognized instantly. She froze, slowly turning around. Conrad Mercer stood several feet behind her, his coat still damp from the cool morning air, his breathing slightly uneven, as if he had arrived in a hurry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The airport noise faded into the background. "You came," Ariel said quietly. Conrad stepped closer. "Yes." She looked down briefly at the suitcase beside her. "You didn't have to." "I did." They stood facing each other in the middle of the terminal, people passing around them without noticing the moment. Ariel crossed her arms slightly. "Why?" Conrad's answer came after a brief pause. "Because you were leaving." "Yes. I didn't want you to." Ariel looked at him carefully. "You didn't say that last night." Conrad exhaled slowly. "I should have." The honesty surprised her. Ariel glanced toward the gate once more. "We were supposed to keep this simple." "Yes, and it stopped being simple a long time ago." Conrad nodded once. "Yes." The silence between them felt different now. Not tense, just real. Ariel studied his face. "Do you regret it?" "Regret what?" "The marriage." Conrad's answer came without hesitation. "No." Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Another pause followed. Then Ariel asked quietly, "What are we now?" The question lingered in the air. Conrad looked at her steadily, and finally spoke. "This marriage started as a contract." Ariel tilted her head slightly. "And now?" Conrad's voice softened. "Now it's the only thing in my life that was never planned." Ariel stared at him for a moment, trying to decide whether the words were enough. Then she looked down at the suitcase again. Her fingers loosened around the handle. Slowly, very slowly, she released it. "You know," she said quietly, "this would have been easier 6 months ago." Conrad nodded. "I know. But it wouldn't have meant the same thing." Another pause passed between them. Then Ariel stepped closer, not dramatically, just one small step, close enough that the distance between them finally disappeared. "Well," she murmured softly, "I guess neither of us planned this." "No." And for the first time that day, a small smile appeared on Conrad's face. The departure announcement echoed through the terminal again. Ariel glanced briefly toward the gate, then back at Conrad. "I suppose I should cancel my flight. That would be practical." She laughed quietly. "You're still terrible at romance." "Yes." They stood there for another moment. Then Ariel picked up her suitcase again, not to leave, but to walk beside him. Together, they turned away from the gate, walking slowly through the airport crowd, not as strangers bound by a contract, but as two people who had spent months resisting something that had quietly grown between them, something neither of them had planned, something both of them had finally chosen. Before we end this story, I want to ask you something. If you were in Ariel's position, would you have accepted the marriage contract in the beginning? And after everything that happened, Do you think she was right to trust Conrad in the end? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to Ms. Wink's Stories for more powerful emotional storytelling just like this one. Because sometimes the most unexpected love stories begin with the arrangements we never meant to keep.